It's Mari McInerney from Croaky here at the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council Biennial Conference in Melbourne, and I have here a dual keynote speaker. Matt, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi Marie. Matt Ball, I'm a nurse practitioner and a psychotherapist. Identify as a person with a lived experience. I'm from Adelaide, South Australia, where I live with my family, and I'm in Melbourne for the conference.
Welcome.
Hi.
You gave very wide-ranging keynotes to the Youth Day and to yesterday's main plenary. What would you say are the main points you were trying to get across here?
I think that's a really nice question, because I think really I was interested to talk about how we can be more expansive in our thinking and not limit ourselves to kind of the rules of what we know in the system, if you like. So if I think about the youth conference, my research into that presentation alarmed me, because what I realised was that I'm not sure how different the youth mental health system actually is to the adult mental health system. So there's this kind of aspect I was talking about, the emperor's new clothes. You know, we've kind of done this thing, but have we done anything different? And so then when I went to the adult conference, I suppose I was talking about the value of lived experience, but also the lived experience community not falling into the same patterns that the system's fallen into, which is thinking they've got all the answers because this is a model they know. And I think I was trying to say, can we be more expansive and say lived experience comes in a variety of ways, including the journey of being a professional in the mental health system can be brutal and very challenging.
Which was a warning to people working in the peer workforce?
No, not really. I mean, there was an aspect of warning, but there was an aspect of me wanting to say, we're talking a lot about peer-led services being the way forward, and this is possibly not the most fashionable thing to say, but I think when we say it's got to be peer-led, we've got to have this model going forward, that sounds a lot like psychiatry, nursing, social work, psychology. We've got the answers, we know the way forward. And I'm saying, how can we embrace all of these dilemmas, take some of the power out of the structures, and therefore give some sort of equity of power about what people might want. I might want a peer worker, psychiatrist, and a social worker. Can I have all three, please? And that was kind of my point.
So how do we get to that?
Well, I suppose we take down capitalism, but no, I don't really believe that, and that's what someone said to me yesterday. But I think Lucy Johnson's power, threat, meaning models are a great example of how we can deconstruct positive and negative uses of power. So yes, we need to increase the power and opportunity of the peer workforce, and I would argue we need to decrease what is experienced by some as the negative use of power of the psychiatric medical profession, the nursing professions, the social work, psychologists at times. I'm really interested in how we can try and say it's all of value, but we have to take understanding of how the power has been formulated, and therefore how we'd like to reformulate the power with a more equity.
You've seen that power imbalance, not only as someone with lived experience, but then working within the system. And you talked about that has particular challenges. You said understanding how people actually think about you and other people with lived experience, but also in copying some pressure yourself in the system. Can you say, what the challenges are there for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, let's name it for what it is. Talking about this comes with risks. So that's what I'm talking about. So I stood up in the mental health system in South Australia and said, there's actually another way to work with voices, psychosis, and that's not about medication, it's not about diagnosis, it's not about a focus on risk under the legislation of the Mental Health Act. It's about looking at human distress and thinking about what we need, how we can be most useful in relationship, and perhaps challenge ourselves to say, gosh, just because I've been told this is a risk doesn't actually mean it's a risk. The person themselves is so unique that their journey is their journey, and the risks come out of that. What happens when you do that, it turns out, is that people feel very threatened. And without getting myself into too much trouble, extraordinary allegations made against me by mental health nurses and medical psychiatry. I won't go into too much detail, but things like allegations I was selling amphetamines, allegations I threatened to bomb a clinic, that I was a threat to the public. And I'm aware we're recording this and I think, gosh, what a vulnerable place. And then I think that's what we're talking about, is that when you name the things that people do as a threat response in power, they respond in threat. So that's been a lot of the experience really, is how do we speak up and then create environments where those who have the power and the authority at the moment can hear us, and we can find middle ground, and then we don't need to make allegations against each other. We just go, wow, I didn't even know that we had such diverse views. I wonder what that would feel like in the middle somewhere.
You've talked about, you've developed some models towards that and also observed some models, in particular I'm thinking Scotland, but also Reawaken. Can you just give us a brief guide to that, because that's still evolving out? Yeah,
so thanks. Reawaken Australia was a 4 or 5 day event in Adelaide, and the idea came out of a recovery camp in Scotland where 100 people came together, and quotes came out like, "This is the best psychiatric hospital in the world," a guy called Ivan Barry said, and he was saying, look, isn't this amazing that a bunch of people with and without mental distress can come together and find real connection and value over a week. So we did this in a slightly different way in Adelaide, and we partnered with the National Empowerment Centre, friends Oryx Cohen and Digitalised Media's PJ Moynihan, who made Healing Voices film. So those two and Stephanie and I at Humane Clinic came together, brought over some speakers and brought together 110 people for 5 days to see what happens if you focus on mental health, addiction and trauma as common realities in our society, not separate but defined within the structures of our current systems as wrong or illness. But actually, if you approach it with compassion and connection, what's useful there? And what came out of that was a manifesto for compassionate change, saying that actually the equity is what allows people to move through these different distresses, whether it's trauma, addiction or mental health needs. And so it was a bit of a unique event. We didn't overload the schedule, and we intentionally talked about alternatives that could be implemented in the system. So things like ED alternatives outside of the legislated framework of the mental health system. Maybe I'll just touch on that. It's a good example. All the time we're seeking to offer ED, emergency department alternatives, under the Mental Health Act. The threshold of risk remains, and the power structures who own the Mental Health Act remain, and the legislation is there. If we sit outside the mental health system, I think Reawaken was talking about we can be more human and more in connection, and we can assess the vulnerabilities and what we call risk in the sense of genuine human connection. So Reawaken's a lot about saying, is it really possible to reform a system that for this 50 years, 100 years, whatever, has built itself a narrative that's become an oppressive power over the staff and people with accessing the system? Or do we actually need to reawaken and say, no, maybe this system isn't fit for purpose? And of course what happens is there's a dichotomy then between, gosh, Matt sounds radical and Reawaken sounds radical, and then the Productivity Commission report that says, I think it's costing $500 million a day or something ridiculous. Well, Reawaken doesn't sound so radical then, does it? Because actually the structures we've got are not working. As numbers of suicide go up, sadly, rates of mental illness, in quotes, go up. Prescribing rates in New Zealand and Australia are on the increase. 49% increase in antipsychotic prescribing up to 2015 in New Zealand. Prescribing rates are over 30,000 per 100,000 people in the cities around this country. The structures just aren't supporting what we need at the moment. And when the Productivity Commission comes together with Reawaken, I think we can kind of go, oh, okay, it's not even that radical or out there. And that was my key message. Okay, so if we know this now, how do we take some of the power out of it and step forward bravely?
It's very much a reform in landscape at the moment, we're told, with the Productivity Commission report out yesterday, the Aged Care Royal Commission report out yesterday, coming up here in Victoria, the Royal Commission into Mental Health report this month. Are you hopeful?
I'm somewhat hopeful and somewhat pessimistic. We have a Royal Commission whose terms of references were set within the institutional structures that we currently have. So that's the double bind, right? You know, we know about the double bind in psychiatric and psychological theory, and there we are watching the double bind play itself out in a Royal Commission. Not to say there's not really good intentional work going on there, but I want to be hopeful, and I also really have fears that by association of contributing to a Royal Commission whose terms of references are set in the old structures, we are somehow getting involved in something that might not be possible to change at its core, at its root. And then I kind of think, well, today VMIAC are going to release their declaration, and I suppose my biggest call is to say in South Australia, where we want to open up an emergency department or alternative outside system, just have a go. I'm not sure what we're going to lose. So I say to politicians, I say to the leaders, you know what, probably if we all take a new step together, we're going to find a lot of joy and a lot of glory. Doesn't mean we have to run down the old system. That's okay, that can still exist, but we can move gradually into a new system. Here in Victoria, you know, VMIAC are doing this amazing work in the community. Let's ask the Minister, can you just embrace the declaration as an equitable document to the Productivity Commission, to the Royal Commission, and say, right, all of these things have equal power. This is the way we could start this change in the structures of positive and negative use of power by saying, gosh, here's a whole section in our community who lead the community in this activism and advocacy. Obviously, we'll take that on. Then we've got these very skillful people in the Royal Commission, we'll take that on. We've got the Productivity Commission, we'll take that on. But create equity in that. So, am I hopeful? Oh, I want to be.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you.